Hello, welcome to Journalism on the Couch. This is our pilot episode where we're gonna talk about climate crisis and the role of media and journalism in particular in the climate crisis. We have a wonderful panel that is gonna introduce themselves. We start from Harry.
I'm Harry. I'm just about to start my third year in broadcast journalism here at the University of Salford. I'm not massively into the climate as sort of an activist, but I'll do my part at home, recycling and trying to cut down emissions where I can and when I can, but I'm not massively sort of fighting for the cause.
Okay, my name's Angela. I'm about to start my third year at Salford Uni, studying human psychology and animal behaviour. Similar to Harry, I'm interested in what I can do in my own life. I recycle, things like that, but haven't done any activism or anything like that towards climate change, but feel very interested in how it's portrayed in the media, in terms of how that affects people's individual psychology. That's what I'm up to.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm coming to the end of my first year, studying a PhD in the representation of minority groups in sports media journalism. And my history in climate change is active membership within the Green Party.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a teacher. I've been involved in Extinction Rebellion for the last 4 years. I've attended a lot of demonstrations, I've organised a lot of demonstrations, I've been arrested twice, and I have 2 young children, and I'm very, very interested in the role of the media in terms of the impact that it has on what progress we do or don't make in addressing the climate crisis.
Excellent point, Hannah. So we start from that question with this panel. What is, do we think, the role of media in addressing the climate crisis and leading to change, if indeed we get any change? Shall we go around and see where we go with this? Harry?
I would say it's definitely something that needs reporting more than it is currently.
Yes.
But how we go about that, I'm not sure, without, I think, scaring people. If you say exactly what's going on, because it is scary. I don't know, people need to know what is happening, but also sometimes it's not the best thing to do on the news to scare people, but it definitely needs to be reported, because at the rate we're going on, it's going to be awful quite soon, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think it's it's a balance between people having to almost choose between what they learn about on a global level, like climate change, and their own mental health. I feel like there's kind of like a fine balance, something like you were saying. If you when it's reported, it's almost like it's depressing to hear about, so it's kind of easier to just not to block it out, or think about, focus on things that are a bit more maybe urgent from a day-to-day level, in like the cost of living crisis has kind of overridden. It almost became like a do we care about the climate or do we care about the cost of living? So I think people were like, we've got to think about the cost of living now, that's affecting my day-to-day, my day-to-day life. The climate kind of, that can be like tomorrow's problem. So I think that's a bit of it, is that it's just been kind of pushed to the side.
Which is a very interesting thing. I mean, if you put together what the two of you have just said, because it is presented as an either or choice. And for some reason, I didn't hear any concern about scaring people, talking about the cost of living or talking about war in Ukraine. Never have I heard, we can't scare people talking about the cost of living, but we do hear it when it comes to climate change. And they are presented as two alternatives, like it's either the cost of living or climate change, whereas we know, at least some literature suggests, that there is a connection between the two. So the cost of living is getting worse because of climate change, but we don't hear it. So why do we think that's the case, and where are we going with it? How do we find a solution to it? What do we think? Do we have opinions?
I think it needs to be reframed in the way it's being presented to the public. It needs a whole reframing of how the issue is being presented, because a lot of, the public, speaking as a member, speaking as a member of the public, you get all your information from the media. That's the only way that you get any of the information. So every single thing that you're absorbing is only coming through the media, whether it's social media, the news. You don't really get it any other way. So it just needs to be completely reframed, to make people feel like it's not an attack on your mental health. It's not a mental health and it's also not a cost of living crisis or a climate crisis. It just needs reframing to be able to be absorbed in a completely different way.
No pressure, Harry.
No pressure. Do that, that's fine.
I think with it's about scaring people like through COVID. Every day there was numbers. This many people have died. This many people have been infected. Whatever, and that it got to a point. I was watching the news every day. I just couldn't watch it anymore because it was scary and it was depressing. So why are they comfortable to publish those figures but not the figures that affect the climate? It's sort of, it doesn't fit what's trying to be presented, if that makes sense, from the government. I don't think it's any side of the government. I think it's all of it, apart from the Green Party and parties that are built on helping the environment. I think it definitely needs to change from the top and filter down, I think.
That's exactly what I was thinking, that we didn't have any problem scaring people with COVID numbers. And I think part of it is, the problem is sometimes it's framed as the climate crisis is a thing that's going to happen to us, and there are a certain amount of impacts that are baked in at this point that are going to happen to us, but it's also a choice that we all make. You know, the choices that we make now in policy, in our individual lives, in our communities, are going to impact how big the crisis becomes for us, and also for the people who are already on the front line. So I think at the moment the narrative is, we can't afford to address climate change, but all of the science, all of the economics says we can't afford not to, and that, you know, in terms of our children, like an awful lot of the government's plans in their net zero targets are based on technology that is completely speculative, that's never been proven to work at scale, and that's really expensive, and our kids are going to have to pay for that. So as a mum, I look down the line and think, if people think cost of living is difficult now, imagine it when half the crops of the world have been wiped out. And there was a really quick narrative when the war in Ukraine happened of suddenly everything's Russia's fault. You know, energy prices are going up because of Russia, and everything is quite easy now to blame on the Ukraine war. And actually, you know, Martin Lewis and other people have come out and said all of these things were starting to happen already. It's just convenient to have a scapegoat out there that's not us. So I think reframing is a massive part of it, because if the climate crisis was just a completely done thing that was going to happen no matter what we did, then I think probably for our mental health you would want to ignore it. But like, imagine if a couple of years before COVID we could have done something to stop it, and the media chose to stay silent. You know, we would all want to have been scared in those couple of years into taking action so that we could avoid the impacts of COVID. And we're in the same place now with the climate crisis, that if people are sufficiently aware of how much it's going to affect us, and, you know, not our grandkids. Again, the narrative I've heard even just a few years ago is like, it'll be hard for our grandkids. It's going to be hard for us. You know, when we are a decade older, long before all of us in this room are old people, the impacts will be massive.
Yeah, already, I don't know if you heard what's happening in Italy. Like, there is hail, there is these dimensions, there are entire towns near where I come from where there are floods and, you know, water. We've had 6 months of complete lack of rain, and then it came all at once in a weird way. Like, weather is going to the extremes and is very unpredictable already. So I completely agree. And it's interesting what you mentioned about the narrative, no? Because in journalism, I'm sure you will learn about constructing a narrative of things, and how, you know, you need to simplify the story. And we were at the Center for Alternative Technology in May, and they were talking about the difficulty of presenting climate science and climate change as an issue, because it's what is called the wicked problem. It's very difficult, and you pull one string, you create a problem the other side. So the challenge for journalism is quite significant. So, for example, as you know, a future journalist, how do you think we can go about simplifying such a complex issue without creating those grey, black and white kind of narratives?
I think it will be difficult, because there will always be two sides, and then what is actually happening, no matter whatever topic it is, there's always two sides and then the truth. But whatever we do, there will be people that are disappointed in how it's been handled. But I think we just need to be more open, be more sort of accepting of what is happening, and find a solution that is fitting for everybody. But there won't be a solution that's fitting for everybody, so it will be difficult, definitely, I think.
Can I comment on that? Because I think one of the things that's been brought up before in terms of the media is, when we talk about the two sides and the different narratives, is transparency over where those narratives are coming from. So, for example, if you have media companies quoting think tanks without interrogating who funds those think tanks, it can be presented as a legitimate alternative to, say, an activist's view. And I've got to say, I really hate the word activist, because it's a way of othering people, and actually an activist is just someone who does something, and they are mums, grandparents, kids, it's just the public. But yeah, so sometimes you see reports come out of think tanks, and it takes a real investigative journalist to unravel those money trails, and they go back to big oil and gas and coal, in the same way that big tobacco was very good at using front scientists to present reports to kind of muddy the waters. So I think part of it, for the challenge for journalists, is looking at who's saying those narratives and what have they got to gain by saying those narratives. Because speaking as a mum, I don't have anything to gain by being arrested. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be pushed to do that. I don't want to have to choose, I have to wonder every day, am I doing enough? Should I risk prison? Or is my duty to my kids to be right here, right now? And that's an awful thing to have to think. Whereas a think tank that's funded by some very rich oil executives, their entire interest is not in solving the problem, it's in short-term profit. And I think it's a good way forward is to ask journalists to look at where those narratives are coming from and what's the motivation for them.
That's a very good point. Adam, can I bring you in with a question? Because Adam has a background in philosophy as well, so I think he can help us here. Are there two sides and then the truth when it comes to these kind of issues?
You mean two different perspectives and then the truth?
Yeah.
Well, I think that depends on how you approach truth, right? In one sense, what we're talking about is a scientific problem. The climate change is a scientific problem, and therefore it's an objective problem. However, if we're presenting a scientific objective problem as a subjective problem, this side says this side says that, we're never going to meet in the middle, because we're literally arguing two separate instances. And so if we were to, from a philosophical point of view, if we were to align what we're necessarily talking about, what is rather lazily the left or the right is talking about big business activism, we would have to only talk in objective terms. These are the numbers, this is the rate in which the environment is heating up, these are the institutions that are causing a raise in the temperatures, as opposed to this group has rioted, how naughty, this group is waiving the laws, let's say, and polluting rivers, how naughty are they. We're bringing in moral dimensions to what is fundamentally an objective conversation.
That's interesting. And Angela, you were saying how often, like, everything we know comes from media. Now, when you are faced with, for example, news where you see the two, opposing views, I'm picking on this issue because there is a journalism rule. Quality journalism is based on balance. Okay, so the idea is that as a quality journalist, you are supposed to represent in the media as many perspectives as there are. If there are two people thinking differently on a matter, they should all be given voice. However, and this is something I personally struggle with as well, because the literature in media and in psychology talks about something called false balance, and Adam kind of picked on it, saying that sometimes there are objective truth. If I say this is a pair of jeans, this is a pair of jeans. I mean, no one can tell me it's a skirt, but someone can say this is a skirt. Do we need to have that person seeing this as a skirt in the news item? Is that a fair representation? Is there a balanced representation of reality? And literature has shown that whenever you present these balanced views, so the climate skeptics and the climate change advocates in the same news, people tend to be less certain about the anthropogenic nature of climate change, and which I found quite interesting, they tend to think the scientists are less coherent among themselves in their agreement about these things. So that journalistic norm of quality journalism, and it is someone trying to do their job properly, ends up being problematic in some cases, and I find that quite interesting. And the same is with COVID. Has it ever happened to you, Angela, that you came across news that they were saying this person says this person said that, and they disagree, and you're not an expert? I know it happened to me with COVID for sure.
Yeah, all the time. There's always that other viewpoint, and I think part of the problem is you're just left not knowing who to trust, so you just trust no one, and that makes you feel powerless. You like, I don't know, like Hannah was saying, you don't know where, as a kind of member of the public, you can't really find out who funded that, who funded this research, you don't ever look that deep into it. You're just presented with the information. And I think at this point, especially with the kind of level of distrust that social media has spread, you see like real journalism, and you just don't trust, you just automatically assume it's coming from somewhere negative. So if you see any information on COVID, you think, yeah, but the figures are lies. Like we were saying, there was all these horrible figures. It was like so many dead, and then you'd hear on social media, the figures have been skewed. The people are dying of other things, and they're calling it COVID. And then so you'd see the figures, and you think, yeah, but are they true? So you just end up not trusting anybody. Basically, you just end up in a position of feeling powerless, feeling you can't trust any information that you're being given, and that's really dangerous in terms of actual change happening, because you can't get anybody to believe you if they just don't believe anything that they're being given. That's what I think one of the biggest challenges is in terms of people actually making change is you have to trust someone. You have to actually be able to trust that someone's giving you some right information, because otherwise you're just going to switch off from all of it, and that's what I think.
So my question there is the role of the journalist to tell you what to think or to provide you with tools with which to think?
I think it depends, because if we're looking at it from a kind of like, I'm studying psychology, so I'm always going to look deeper. I'm always going to be questioning what I'm being told. I'm always going to look at it with that critical, analytical eye of where, you know. But I think that's asking a lot of of people that aren't thinking like that, who are just kind of sitting watching the news while they're having their breakfast. They're not going to be looking at it with that kind of critical eye. So I do think in a way, in a kind of broad way, they do need to kind of tell you a little bit, because you can't really trust that people are going to take that information and then do something with it themselves. A lot of people are going to take what they see at face value, and then get that conflicting message, and well, that's just confused me now. And I think a lot of people probably don't want to put that much effort into what they're thinking. They just kind of want to be told. People tend to like to be told by someone, like somebody in control or in power. This is almost what you should be thinking. People kind of like the path of least resistance. I'm just going to go with what I'm being told rather than thinking for myself. So that's where the psychology comes in, because people don't want to put that much effort into making up their own opinion or making up their mind. They just kind of want to kind of do what they're told a little bit. So yeah, I think it's just a dangerous thing, because you can't really trust that people are going to put that much effort. Not everybody is going to put that much effort.
I'm interested in what you think about this, Harry, as someone who's obviously gone through the education system more recently. But my perspective as a teacher is that we have a huge problem with thinking skills and critical thinking, because our education system is not set up to develop them. And in my teaching career, I've seen the big curriculum change in primary that came in 2014 was a kind of big shift from a much more open, there were all kinds of problems, but a more open way of approaching things, to a rote learning. Education is knowledge and facts that the job of the teacher is to pass on to the children. The job of the children is to absorb. And it really worries me that we're not in an age where, you know, like you were saying about knowing who to trust in this post-truth world. I would say one of the most fundamental skills children can have these days is to be critical thinkers and to ask themselves where their information's coming from and to interrogate it, particularly because kids I don't think kids will get most of their information from the media. I think it will be from social media. So I think we've got to address that in education.
I completely agree. I think with the way education is now, you're given facts, and you're not taught how to sort of gain your own opinion on what you're given. And I think from what you've said, that will affect especially the younger generation and my generation as well. Everything's on social media, and that's where people are getting their information a lot of the time. So it needs to be taught how you can look at what you're given and assess it and get your own opinion from that, I think.
I find this very interesting because, well, obviously as a university teacher, I tend to believe that people of all ages are capable of thinking for themselves, and they're not there waiting for me to, for an example in the lecture, to tell them what to do. But that is what happens very often. Students, for example, they would come and expect me to give them the solution rather than to help them finding their own solutions to things. However, I think in that sense there is a lot we all can do about it, and I think it starts from disrupting the cycle. So I refuse and will always refuse to use to address my students as 5-year-olds that need to be spoon-fed. I'll never do it, and I might pay the flack for it, but it doesn't matter. But I think the same thing is quite interesting, because I was many years ago, I don't know if it was media training or what, or I was talking to some media expert, but they told me you need to think the audience is 5-year-olds. Like, I refuse to talk to an audience addressing them as if they were 5-year-olds. And that doesn't mean not making, I recognize my language could be difficult or something, and it's because I don't have alternative registers, so I only know certain things. Either I swear that I can't do on TV, or I talk like an academic. But there is a middle ground, right? And I think it's about, like you say, giving the facts, and I think you can give the facts even talking about them in a way that is comprehensible to people, and recognizing that people have different levels of education, different types of vocabulary, etc., but at the same time I feel like almost I would be disrespecting others if I am addressing them as if they were 5-year-olds. And I do wonder, we were talking about it earlier, if this oversimplification of a wicked problem like climate change is what really gave rise to all the debates, the conspiracy theories associated with it, because they oversimplify the problem. And so then if you simplify a complex issue, and then you get, you can get someone else coming in and giving an alternative, very simple, basic explanation. Neither is accurate. But then people, because, let's face it, climate change is a bad thing. I was trying to find a polite way to say it. It's a bad thing. So people then will obviously try and find, avoid to be faced with this, cruel, scary, damning thing. That also entails that they need to get their act together and change the way they live. So I find that interesting.
I read a really interesting article the other day that was about how climate science has been communicated, and it was saying, like, I think if you ask the general public, what do they know about the climate crisis, probably 1.5 degrees is a thing that people know, that's what we're aiming for, and the Paris Accords and things. And it was saying all of those kind of numbers aren't helpful at all, because the smallness of creeping up by 0.1 degrees, when the only way in which we're all familiar with degrees is like the temperature might be 25 or it might be 30 or it might be 18, is very hard to understand for a non-scientist, even as someone who's done talks on it for years, how much that's an average, and that will push the extremes out. And it was saying, instead of reporting numbers like that, reporting numbers like, and they were talking about somewhere in Italy, this place is now 4 times hotter than it was 5 years ago. This place experiences 10 times as much rainfall as it did. And those are numbers that we can compute, because they relate to our everyday lives, and they don't require scientific understanding. They relate to our experience. And to me, that's what doesn't cut through. And as someone, like, for the last 4 years, I've been going around giving talks to the public and to institutions like the WI and things. And I often do it alongside another friend from XR Trafford who's a scientist. And it's interesting how we both communicate very differently. So to her, the science is convincing. She wants to hear the objective problem, the numbers, without any kind of embellishment, without, she wants to see that it's directly translatable to what is happening out there. And to me, the science doesn't convince at all, because I'm not interested in science. I'm a kind of creative humanities kind of person. So what convinces me is if I see a writer speaking very eloquently about what the impact is, about what the moral issues are, about a kind of emotive appeal to our feelings as parents and our feelings as like animal lovers as well, to what we're doing to the species around the world. So there's an interesting question there of what cuts through. You know, do you need different ways of cutting through to different people? Do you focus, you know, how should journalists do it, I guess, because journalism, quality journalism, is not supposed to be emotive, but actually it is an emotive thing. And you know, some of the media coverage of like Greta Thunberg, for example, crying, the ridicule and the scorn that gets poured on her, as if it's not an appropriate response to cry when you understand that your future is not going to have all these things that you maybe dreamed on. You know, that you understand that your future is going to be dire, and that actually for other people that's their present. You know, the idea that that emotion is not appropriate when we're discussing it in the media, I think, is a really big thing to challenge.
And that's quite interesting, and I'm coming to you, Harry, because there are different styles of journalism, no? And we know, for example, tabloid newspapers have built their entire business around over sensationalizing, tabloidizing, excessive reliance on emotions, etc., etc. Whereas quality journalism is based on this idea of neutrality, objectivity, and stuff like that. So how do you see it as a journalist?
I see it that, like you said, quality journalism is unbiased. These are the facts. However, at the minute, I don't think there's any platform that is giving that. And that's what we need to get back to, especially with issues like climate change. And as well, the cost of living, as you were mentioning, Angela. It needs to be, these are the facts, and this is what these experts are saying. And evaluating everything, not just, I think, what the backers are promoting, because like, as you were saying earlier, there's big oil backers, coal backers that are funding mainstream media, and so that's where the opinions are coming from. So I think it definitely needs just to be, with any topic really, in mainstream media such as the BBC, ITV, things like that, should be, these are the facts and this is what's happening, and not having the emotion. Certain topics will be emotive, of course they will be, but sort of taking it away and just presenting the facts is definitely what we need to get back to. But how we do that, I'm not sure, because it is the people that are funding the news programmes that are going to affect that. Because if, as a producer, I would say, this is what we're going to do, and they say no, you can't change it. So it definitely is something that needs to go from the top, but how we get there, I'm unsure of.
Can I just come in on that? I kind of almost completely disagree.
Right.
Because I think you can present facts to people, but if you don't get them to care, they won't change. Like, if you don't speak to people's emotions and get them emotionally involved in the subject, if you're just presenting it completely objectively and these are the facts, and people are like, okay, right, go on about my day. If you don't get them to care, sometimes change hurts. Change hurts. Like, if you're making any change in your life, like for example, if you're going vegan or going vegetarian or whatever, you're doing something, a personal change, it hurts. It hurts to opening your eyes to what is the reality of what is happening. Actually hurts. It's actually a painful experience, and I think we almost kind of need to. People need to go through that emotional upset and emotional realization and emotional awakening before they will be actually motivated to make any sort of change. So I think it does have to be. It does have to be an emotional thing. There's a thing in psychology of a kind of like a distance effect, where if you present like you were saying, Sharon, about the climate change things that are happening in Italy, if you tell people in like the northwest of England that's what's happening in Italy, that's Italy's problem. What am I going to do about that? Me buying less plastic or whatever isn't going to change. It's almost like it's happening to somebody else, and it's only when you actually make it real for that person, for that actual person's life, that, like you were saying, Hannah, about having children, that makes it relevant to you all the time because you care about their future. So you're invested in the future. By having children, you have automatically become invested in, you want a world for them that you want them to live in. So that's got your emotional investment straight away. But for somebody that hasn't got that, you could just think, oh, how does it affect me? So I think you do have to get to that emotion.
I 100% see where you're coming from with that.
Yeah. Again, we've got two sides of the different thing, haven't we? Yeah, it's probably somewhere in the middle.
But no, from hearing you say that, I do actually think, you know what?
Yeah, without that emotion.
Definitely. I do agree with what you said there. Yeah.
I think as well, it's picking which facts, isn't it? Even if your mission is, I'm just going to present the facts. It's like, are you presenting the facts of what's impacting a family in Liverpool right now, or are you presenting the facts of, well, in Pakistan, this many people have died? Are you showing empty supermarket shelves and actually explaining that the implications of this is going to only increase? Things like, it's interesting, isn't it? Things like that, seeing empty shelves in COVID on the supermarkets was for the more fortunate people in society who can afford to eat on a daily basis, which is an increasingly small proportion, but it was like a real, like you were saying, like a real upset, a real jolt of like, oh my God, I can't get hold of food. How am I going to feed my children? And that's very visceral. And I think, having journalism where you show that, and it got to the point where actually, conversations being had about, was that appropriate to show that in the media, because it being covered in the media then creates panic buying behaviour, and so it kind of becomes this snowballing effect, doesn't it? But I was watching that and thinking, I feel really scared by this right now, but I also feel scared that I know that this is what's coming down the line, and I want other people to connect the dots between what happened to us in COVID, those visceral shocks, and the visceral shocks we're going to feel, because we went back, COVID was like this eye-opening thing where everyone was like, nature's amazing and we need all these green and blue spaces for our mental health, and we could live differently and we could share as communities, and there's a different way to be. And then once COVID receded, real life poured back in
immediately.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, there are two interesting things there. One is about images. There is a paper that was published. There are several papers published on images and the role of images in news. There is Elizabeth Grabe wrote a book called Image Bite Politics, where she talks about news and the role of images. But there was this particular article, it was about Spanish coverage of climate change, and it was saying how very often news were not presented or talked about when they concern climate change because they didn't have images to go with it, and journalists didn't know how to present that information in a way that could appeal, because the rule of television news is that you need a video to go with the thing, and people are tired of polar bears, and they easily disconnect from it. So creating a kind of imagery to go with it, it's dreadful to say, but it will be useful. The visual, like in my case, when I saw the hail things that were big as an orange, I was like, that's scary. When you see the streets of a town where I have been completely covered by water, that's scary. We've had similar events here, floods and things. Those could be, archived and saved in a way to explain these phenomena. So that's the first thing. The second issue, it was about the need to address this issue from a broader kind of perspective. I try to include it and present it as something that involves us, and I think it links to some work on expertise and the voices that we hear. Whose voices do we hear in the news? And why do we hear those voices? We have seen with the opening of the internet that many people kind of try to express themselves and find spaces for their voices to be heard. So we know people feel the need to talk and be part of the dialogue of the what we would call the public sphere, right? We want to be part of a public sphere, and we're no longer in small towns where we could go to the agora, the square, and talk to each other like I wasn't there, but like they used to do, right? We have the internet instead. We have the news, and one of the things, I don't know if it's a crazy idea, and I'm asking you, Harry, because you're the journalist. So, but I'm like, very often there is a lot of work on Vox Populi.
Yes.
Yeah, and how it's often used to put across a particular angle to the news, or as a filler when you stick in the pot. Can you envision a way to use the sources of your news in a different way? How would you see it?
So I think, as you said with Vox Pops, while it is getting a wider view of everybody, it is sort of just something that's used a lot, so I think people would switch off to it. So getting the sources and using them differently, I'm not too sure how you could change it to be effective, to be honest. I've not thought about it before now, actually.
Good, I've done my job.
Yeah. It's made me think, actually, how you could sort of present, because you're still using the same news gathering but presenting it in a different way, using a different way, putting it forward a different way. So yeah, it is quite interesting that to think about. I don't know what to say on it at the minute.
Well,
it has made me think. I'm not sure.
It's very interesting because I agree with you, and I think very often now Twitter or social media posts have taken the place of what used to be Vox Pop. So you see now mainstream news with this person tweeted this, that person tweeted that, and that is used, and we don't recognize that. That's kind of giving the idea that what is on Twitter represents reality.
Yes, yeah.
And that's very fascinating if you think of it.
Because you don't know who's behind that Twitter post either. It could say it's whoever who lives in Salford, but actually it's somebody massive who's putting forward their agenda. So yeah, it is something that I've never thought of it that way, but yeah. It needs to be. It's putting that Twitter is fact and it's not. It's just opinions, and should we be presenting that as news? Probably not. No.
And it's unregulated. It's
exactly.
Like Twitter's just anyone could just tweet anything.
Yeah.
And it instantly becomes it's instantly out there in the in the
You
world.
can delete it, but it's there.
Yeah, it's been retweeted thousands of times, and then it becomes fact in people's minds. As soon as they read that, it just becomes a fact. It's
I know people that will see something on Twitter and they're like, "Oh, that's true, then, isn't it?" But you've not looked behind that. You read the headline, you don't read the article, and they're presenting that, and then they've told one person in the pub, another person told that person in the shop, and then things are getting spread. So it needs to be presented that what you see online isn't true.
It comes back to trust as well, because it was like if you see something on the news about climate change, you might say this is happening, this bad weather's happened here, miles away from you, and give you facts and figures, and you think, right, that's depressing, and then you switch it off, and then you see something on Twitter and it could be like a complete opposite view, like climate change is being exaggerated in this way, and there's a thing in psychology where people believe the trust is what matters. So if people are more likely to believe something on Facebook than they are on Instagram, because Facebook is like your close friends. So the people that you're friends with, you're more likely to believe information coming from them. So if you see one, you could see this really interesting climate change news story, and it can be just wiped out immediately by one comment that a friend's done on Facebook, and it undoes that information. So the power of social media is unregulated, and it is just massive. I think that's where people get the main kind of damaging information that's not true, not regulated.
I think the flip side of that is the democratisation of media, isn't it? Because what you've traditionally had is these media gatekeepers that allow certain voices to be heard and not others. And what social media does is allow the participation of those other voices. So a lot of the climate stuff that I see doesn't come via the media, but it does come via people that I trust within the climate movement. And it will be footage of, for example, like recent really bad flooding in Spain that I had no idea was happening, but was horrifying to watch, like people on top of their cars being floated very fast down a street. And again, you know, when you have an emotional connection to that, like I used to live in Spain, so I can imagine myself in that scenario. And yeah, I mean, it's a great power for good or evil, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a thing that can be used in many different ways, but I suppose we do have to recognise that it allows some perspectives to be heard that are not ever shown on the media, particularly those in the global south.
How well do you think it is being utilised by activist movements?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of your own bubble. Certainly, you know, what I'm fed is a lot of climate stuff that agrees with my perspective and doesn't particularly challenge my perspective. Certainly when I put stuff out there on social media, I know exactly who will respond to it, and it's the people who already know. So there is definitely, there's a big element of preaching to the converted. I don't know, is the answer to that, I guess. My fear is that it's a much bigger tool for the conspiracy theorists and climate deniers than it is for climate activists. And you know, there's been some research into like the YouTube algorithms and stuff that prioritise climate denial things to the top of people's feeds. It very much scares me that what you're fed is just confirmation of what you already think. I think that's the biggest risk for those of us in the climate movement as well, because you can fall into a trap of being very, very passionate about this issue and caring a lot about it and being quite fixated on it, and then not seeing the perspective, for example, of someone who is, like you were saying about cost of living, Angela, like really struggling right now. And you know, if you don't hear those other perspectives, and you don't, you know, some people do have very legitimate perspectives that challenge what you think, but if you don't hear them, you only ever hear that you are right, and you know that other people who think like you are right, and you lose that ability to take on multiple perspectives.
I think like what you're talking about is like echo chambers. When you've got that kind of social media, it becomes an echo chamber, so it's just feeding you back what you already know, and you're not seeing any alternative views, and it's one of like the most dangerous things, especially in like conspiracy theories, because it just feeds that. It just feeds that bias. It's just that echo chamber just keeps that feeding kind of cycle going. And some people with the algorithms, the way they're set up is just, that is kind of how they're set up, to feed people what they know they want to see. So then you could, I guess you could really look back and think it's the algorithms that need to change, because that's what's kind of set up. It's like a feedback loop, isn't it? Literally, like the echo chamber is, it's just feeding you what they know you are going to consume, just to keep, I think like we were saying about, it's about kind of like eyes on the screen. You just, to get them eyes on the screen, they're just going to feed you what they know you want to see. They know if the algorithm feeds you something you don't want to see, you'll go, oh no, I don't want to see it, and switch off, which is what they don't want. So they just feed you what you already want to know. But what do you do about that?
I have an idea.
Yeah.
I sometimes click on stuff I don't care at all about, just to trick the algorithm. In that way, I get fed other stuff that I wouldn't see otherwise, just because it bothers me. So that's one way, you know, take a little bit of power back, which links also to media literacy and stuff. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I don't know you guys, but I'm very hungry. So I'm thinking we can have a last round with the one thing that you really want to say at the end of this experience. Each of us says the one thing, and we wrap it up. This first episode I'm very happy with. Okay? Okay. Who wants to start?
I'll say. I think the emotional connection would be the thing that I've kind of taken away from this discussion. Is if you don't emotionally connect with people, you're never going to get them to change. How you do that through, it's kind of like Sharon was saying, if you pull one thread, you unravel another. Even just talking about it, you can see that if you kind of solve one problem, you make another. So how you do that, I don't know, but that's like the journalism kind of. But from the psychology point of view, I think if you don't get people's trust, you don't get people's emotional investment, you're just never gonna get through. That was.
I just think I've learned a lot just by listening to everybody, and it has changed my opinion on some things as well. Like you're saying, getting people's emotions in, I think that's, in my eyes, that's more important now than it was before I sat down. So I think it has been beneficial, definitely, just sitting and talking to people that you wouldn't necessarily talk to at any other time, and getting those differences of opinions. I think, as we were saying about social media, that's something that we're doing that needs to change with the algorithms, so that you can get another side that you weren't necessarily getting before. Open your eyes to other people's points of view.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've taken away is the framing of climate change. I think even within this discussion, very specifically, we've framed it as, I think the words were cruel, generally negative framing of the future, whereas I wonder if framing it as, in some ways, as opportunity would be a much more positive dimension to take. I don't mean to overgeneralise, but let's say steel workers in Wales now have no industry, but climate change technology, which may or may not be possible, is an opportunity to retrain and tackle the problem at a larger scale.
I think I would say that I would love to see a lot more training for journalists, a lot more carbon literacy, because we've talked a lot about critical thinking and the need to interrogate how trustworthy sources of information are, and I would like to see all journalists being really well equipped to ask the right questions when they're doing interviews, or when they're choosing news sources, or just joining the dots between different stories. And I think that, there are obviously going to be actors within the media that are very intent on portraying a particular viewpoint. I'm particularly thinking of like the billionaire-owned press. But there are also a huge number of like brilliant journalists out there who just don't know enough to be able to effectively challenge some of the narratives. So I think that's important.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I've learned a lot. I have pages of notes to witness that. But I'll leave us with a message of hope. I think the biggest thing that I've learned today is that we need more dialogue. We need to sit together and really understand each other and have a more variety in the interactions we have with everyone. That's what I've learned. What have you learned this time? See you next time with a new lesson.